Section 3 of T. DeWitt Talmage as I Knew Him. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marianne. T. DeWitt Talmage as I Knew Him by Thomas DeWitt Talmage. The Second Milestone, Part 2. As Dr. Scott rose that day, he said, "Mr. President, I think this examination has gone on long enough, and I move it be stopped, and that the examination be pronounced satisfactory, and that this young man be licensed to preach the gospel, and that this afternoon we proceed to his ordination and installation." The motion was put and carried, and I was released from a Protestant purgatory. But the work was not yet done. By rule of that excellent denomination, of which I was then a member, the call of a church must be read and approved before it can be lawfully accepted. The call from that dear old church at Belleville was read, and in it I was provided with a month's summer vacation. Dr. Hardman rose, and said that he thought that a month was too long a vacation, and he proposed 2 weeks. Then Dr. Scott arose and said, if any change were made, he would have the vacation 6 weeks. "For," said he, "that young man does not look very strong physically, and I believe he should have a good long rest every summer." But the call was left as it originally read, promising me a month of recuperation each year. At the close of that meeting of classis, Dr. Scott came up to me, took my right hand in both his hands, and said, "I congratulate you on the opportunity that opens here. Do your best, and God will see you through. And if some Saturday night you find yourself short of a sermon, send down to Newark, only 3 miles, and I will come up and preach for you." Can anyone imagine the difference of my appreciation of Dr. Hardman and Dr. Scott? Only a few weeks passed on, and the crisis that Dr. Scott foresaw in my history occurred, and Saturday night saw me short of a sermon. So I sent a messenger to Dr. Scott. He said to the messenger, "I am very tired, have been holding a long series of special services at my church, but that young Talmage must be helped, and I will preach for him tomorrow night." He arrived in time, and preached a glowing and rousing sermon on the text, "Have ye received the Holy Ghost?" As I sat behind him in the pulpit and looked upon him, I thought, what a magnificent soul you are, tired out with your own work, and yet come up here to help a young man to whom you are under no obligation. Well, that was the last sermon he ever preached. The very next Saturday he dropped dead in his house. Outside of his own family, no one was more broken hearted at his obsequies than myself, to whom he had, until the meeting of classis, been a total stranger. I stood at his funeral in the crowd beside a poor woman with a faded shawl and worn out hat, who was struggling up to get one look at the dear old face in the coffin. She was being crowded back. I said, "Follow me, and you shall see him." So I pushed the way up for her as well as myself, and when we got up to the silent form, she burst out crying, and said, "That is the last friend I had in the world." Dr. Hardman lived on. He lived to write a letter when I was called to Syracuse, New York, a letter telling a prominent officer of the Syracuse church that I would never do at all for their pastor. He lived on until I was called to Philadelphia, and wrote a letter to a prominent officer in the Philadelphia church, telling them not to call me. Years ago he went to his rest, but the 2 men will always stand in my memory as opposites in character. The one taught me a lesson never to be forgotten about how to treat a young man, and the other a lesson about how not to treat a young man. Dr. Scott and Dr. Hardman, the antipodes. So my first settlement as a pastor was in the village of Belleville, New Jersey. My salary was $800 and a parsonage. The amount seemed enormous to me. I said to myself, "What, all this for 1 year?" I was afraid of getting worldly under so much prosperity. I resolved to invite all the congregation to my house in groups of 25 each. We began. Footnote: While at Belleville, Dr. Talmage married Miss Mary Avery of Brooklyn, New York, by whom he had 2 children, a son, Thomas DeWitt, and a daughter, Jessie. Mrs. Talmage was accidentally drowned on the Schuylkill River while Dr. Talmage was pastor of the Second Reformed Church of Philadelphia. End footnote. We began, and as they were the best congregation in all the world, and we felt nothing was too good for them, we plied all the luxuries on the table. I never completed the undertaking. At the end of 6 months I was in financial despair. I found that we not only had not the surplus of luxuries, but we had a struggle to get the necessaries. Although the first call I ever had was to Piermont, New York, my first real work began in the Reformed Church of Belleville, New Jersey. I preached at Piermont in the morning, and at the congregational meeting held in the afternoon of the same day, it was resolved to invite me to become pastor. But for the very high hill on which the parsonage was situated, I should probably have accepted it. I was delighted with the congregation, and with the grand scenery of that region. I was ordained to the gospel ministry and installed as pastor on July 29, 1856. My brother Goyne preaching the sermon from the text 1 Corinthians chapter 3 verses 12 and 13. Rev. Dr. Benjamin C. Taylor, the oldest minister present, offered the ordaining prayer, and about 20 hands were laid upon my head. All these facts are obtained from a memorandum made by a hand that long since forgot its cunning and kindness. The 3 years passed in Belleville were years of hard work. The hardest work in a clergyman's lifetime is during the first 3 years. No other occupation or profession puts such strain upon one's nerves and brain. 2 sermons and a lecture per week are an appalling demand to make upon a young man. Most of the ministers never get over that first 3 years. They leave upon one's digestion or nervous system a mark that nothing but death can remove. It is not only the amount of mental product required of a young minister, but the draft upon his sympathies and the novelty of all that he undertakes, his first sermon, his first baptism, his first communion service, his first pastoral visitation, his first wedding, his first funeral. My first baptism was of Lily Webster, a black-eyed baby who grew up to be as beautiful a woman as she was a child. I baptized her. Rev. Dr. John Dowling, of the Baptist Church, New York, preached for me, and my church got his sermon on "I saw a great multitude which no man could number, of all nations, and kindreds, and people, and tongues, clothed in white robes." In my verdancy, I feared that the doctor, who did not believe in the baptism of infants, might take it for a personal affront that I had chosen that evening for my first baptism. Sometimes at the baptism of children, while I have held up one hand in prayer, I have held up the other in amazement that the parents should have weighed the babe with such a dissonant and repulsive nomenclature. I have not so much wondered that some children should cry out at the christening font, as that others, with such smiling faces, should take a title that will be the burden of their lifetime. There is no excuse because there are scriptural names to call a child Jehoiakim or Tiglath-Pileser. I baptized one by the name of Bathsheba. Why, under all the circumambient heaven, any parent should want to give a child the name of that loose creature of Scripture times, I cannot imagine. I have often felt at the baptismal altar, when names were announced, somewhat like saying, as did the Rev. Dr. Richards, of Morristown, New Jersey, when a child was handed to him for baptism, and the names given, "Hadn't you better call it something else?" On this occasion I had adopted the theory, which I long since abandoned, that an officiating clergyman at baptism should take the child in his arms. Now, there are many ministers who do not know how to hold a baby, and they frighten the child and increase the anxiety of the mother, and may create a riot all along the line if there be other infants waiting for the ceremony. After reading the somewhat prolonged liturgy of the dear old Reformed Church, I came down from the pulpit and took the child in my arms. She was, however, far more composed than myself, and made no resistance. But the overpowering sensation attached to the first application of the holy chrism is a vivid and everlasting memory. Then, the first pastoral visitation. With me, it was at the house of a man suffering from dropsy in the leg. He unbandaged the limb, and insisted upon my looking at the fearful malady. I never could with any composure look at pain, and the last profession in all the world suited to me would have been surgery. After praying with the man and offering him scriptural condolence, I started for home. My wife met me with anxious countenance, and said, "How did you get hurt, and what is the matter?" The sight of the lame leg had made my leg lame, and unconsciously I was limping on the way home. But I had quite another experience with a parishioner. He was a queer man, and a bad odor in the community. Some time previously his wife had died, and although a man of plenty of means, in order to economize on funeral expenses, he had wheeled his wife to the grave on a wheelbarrow. This economy of his had not led the village to any higher appreciation of the man's character. Having been told of his inexpensive eccentricities, I was ready for him when one morning he called at the parsonage. As he entered he began by saying, "I came in to say that I don't like you." "Well," I said, "that is a strange coincidence, for I cannot bear the sight of you. I hear that you are the meanest man in town, and that your neighbors despise you. I hear that you wheeled your wife on a wheelbarrow to the graveyard." To say the least, our conversation that day was unique and spirited, and it led to his becoming a most ardent friend and admirer. I have had multitudes of friends, but I have found in my own experience that God so arranged it that the greatest opportunities of usefulness that have been opened before me were opened by enemies. And when, years ago, they conspired against me, their assault opened all Christendom to me as a field in which to preach the gospel. So you may harness your antagonists to your best interests and compel them to draw you on to better work. He allowed me to officiate at his second marriage, did this mine enemy. All the town was awake that night. They had somehow heard that this economist at obsequies was to be remarried. Well, I was inside his house trying, under adverse circumstances, to make the twain one flesh. There were outside demonstrations most extraordinary, and all in consideration of what the bridegroom had been to that community. Horns, trumpets, accordions, fiddles, firecrackers, tin pans, howls, screeches, huzzas, halloos, missiles striking the front door, and bedlam let loose. Matters grew worse as the night advanced, until the town authorities read the riot act, and caused the only cannon belonging to the village to be hauled out on the street and loaded, threatening death to the mob if they did not disperse. Glad I am to say that it was only a farce and no tragedy. My mode of first meeting this queer man was a case in which it is best to fight fire with fire. I remember also the first funeral. It nearly killed me. A splendid young man skating on the Passaic River in front of my house had broken through the ice, and his body after many hours had been grappled from the water and taken home to his distracted parents. To be the chief consoler in such a calamity was something for which I felt completely incompetent. When in the old but beautiful church the silent form of the young man whom we all loved rested beneath the pulpit, it was a pull upon my emotions I shall never forget. On the way to the grave, in the same carriage with the eminent Reverend Dr. Fish, who helped in the services, I said, "This is awful. One more funeral like this will be the end of us." He replied, "You will learn after a while to be calm under such circumstances. You cannot console others unless you preserve your own equipoise." Those years at Belleville were to me memorable. No vacation, but 3 times a day I took a row on the river. Those old families in my congregation I can never forget. The Van Rensselaers, the Stevenses, the Wards. These families took me under their wing. At Mr. Van Rensselaer's we dined every Monday. It had been the habit of my predecessors in the pulpit. Grand old family. Their name not a more synonym for wealth than for piety. Mrs. Van Rensselaer was one of the saints clear up in the heaven of one's own appreciation. William Stevens was an embodiment of generosity. He could not pray in public, or make a speech, but he could give money, and when he had plenty of it he gave in large sums, and when monetary disaster came, his grief was that he had nothing to give. I saw him go right through all the perturbations of business life. He was faithful to God. I saw him one day worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. I saw him the next day and he was not worth a farthing. Stevens! How plainly he comes before me as I think of the night in 1857 after the New York banks had gone down and he had lost everything except his faith in God, and he was at the prayer meeting to lead the singing as usual. And, not noticing that from the fatigues of that awful financial panic he had fallen asleep, I arose and gave out the hymn, "My drowsy powers, why sleep ye so?" His wife wakened him, and he started the hymn at too high a pitch and stopped, saying, "That is too high." Then he started it at a low pitch and stopped, saying, "That is too low." It is the only mistake I ever heard him make, but the only wonder is that amid the circumstances of broken fortunes he could sing at all. Dr. Samuel Ward. He was the angel of health for the neighborhood. Before anyone else was up any morning, passing along his house you would see him in his office reading. He presided at the first nativity in my household. He it was that met me at the railroad station when I went to preach my first sermon as a candidate, at Belleville. He medicated for many years nearly all the wounds for body and mind in that region. An elder in the church, he could administer to the soul as well as to the perishable natures of his patients. and the Duncans, broad Scotch as they were in speech. I was so much with them that I got unconsciously some of the Scotch brogue in my own utterance. William, cautious and prudent; John, bold and venturesome; both so high in my affections. Among the first ones that I ask for in heaven will be John and William Duncan. Gasherie De Witt. He embodied a large part of the enterprise and enthusiasm of the place. He had his head full of railroads long before the first spike was driven for an iron pathway to the village. We were much together, and ardently attached. We went fishing together on long summer days, he catching the fish, and I watching the process. When we dedicated the first Brooklyn Tabernacle he was present, and gave the money for building a baptistry in the pulpit, and gave besides $100 for his wife and each one of his children. When we parted from each other at Oxford, England, he to go to Geneva, Switzerland, to die, and I to come back to America, much of sweet acquaintanceship and complete confidence ended for this world, only to be taken up under celestial auspices. But time and space would fail to tell of the noble men and women that stood around me in those early years of my ministry. They are all gone, and their personality makes up a large part of my anticipation of the world to come. End of the second milestone.